Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Test 1, 2.
Oh, great. I can hear
Can
you.
you hear us?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you very much.
We hear you. Can you talk a little bit? Do a little sound check for us?
Sure. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Great.
All right. Yeah, your camera angle is better now.
Okay, great.
No, don't. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. Do you have some slides to share?
Yes, yes, I do.
Can you share them so we can see that everything works fine?
Okay, let me see. Can you see it?
Great. If you want to go to slideshow, so
Sure. Here you
there
go.
we go. Excellent. And then advance through the slides. Great. Beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you very
Great.
much. So we will be sharing at the beginning of the program, then we stop sharing. And then when you hear your name call, you can just start sharing your slides. Okay.
Sure. Okay. Got it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you stop sharing, please?
Sure.
The slides.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the session that you've all been dying to attend all week. We know you're here for the intellectual feast that awaits you as opposed to the coffee outside, but you're very, very welcome. And thank you for coming. My name is Justin Mundy. I am very much involved with Nature Finance and the Sustainable Linked Sovereign Debt Hub, wearing a lot of different hats. But Nature Finance has been, as some of you may know, critically involved in the TNFD going forward over the years. And it's a great pleasure to be co-hosting this with the TNFD. We have, I think, a bit of a challenge in front of us. So many of the conversations this week have been around the understanding that we are facing a sort of exponential crisis. We are already at the 1.5 with El Nino's help that we actually thought some of us years ago was going to be in 25 years. But we're now there, more or less. And therefore, the sort of linear responses which we've been thinking about are tragically not as relevant as they might be, because we have run out of time. We actually have now reached the end of the road where we can beguile ourselves the luxury that we can think about this for the next 5 years and then something nice is going to happen. So we have to take the actions. We have to take the actions now. And therefore, we have to celebrate the work of TNFD in these last few years. And particularly poor Emily, who has been working unbelievably hard on the great launch a couple of days ago. I just want to make two quick framing remarks, if I can. It's interesting if you look at the NGFS, the Greening Financial Services process for looking at scenarios. They have 3 orders of magnitude, which I'm sure you're very familiar with: orderly, disorderly, and the hothouse world. Well, I think the orderly transition we can assume is past. It's getting pretty disorderly, and we're rapidly, I think, moving towards the hothouse world. And that means that we're not in this area where we can think of things happening with a degree of regularity. We're moving away from complexity into a stochastic scenario. I worked for my sins many years ago with an extern doing the Stern review, and we assumed that this stochastic breakdown of ecosystem functionality was going to happen when we hit 5 degrees, 4 to 5 degrees. But actually, as you'll see, we have massively underestimated the interrelationships between sectors and ecosystems. So we're now facing with this particular challenge. The reaction to that, in terms of what the public sector and the private sector are doing, is obviously based on a regulatory approach, but also how the private sector operates. And here, some of us have been working on the issues of macro debt, how macro debt should be looked at in terms of climate risk and natural capital risk, what that means in terms of private sector investment, how the credit rating agencies should respond, but then critically how companies within that framing should look at their own risks. TNFD, TCFD are happily coming together, and they need to, because we're not dealing with 2 silos of operations. We're dealing with 2 things which are inextricably linked and are themselves multipliers on themselves. So this merger of the relationship and the metrics and the parameters of TNFD and TCFD, I think should be warmly welcomed. It will have a massive impact in terms of how the finance sector works. It will have a massive impact on transparency. It will have a massive impact on the question which I think many companies are soon going to be asked, which is not what is your IRR, but actually how stranded is your asset and what are you going to say in court? Because I think it's important that we recognize from a fiduciary responsibility point of view, to understand the risks and not do anything about it is not a great thing to do as a director. So the work of the TCFD and the TNFD, and particularly now today the TNFD, in bringing these things together, provide this matrix of a parameter where people have to respond, could not be more important. And on that, you'd be pleased to know, ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to listen to me anymore. You do, luckily, have to listen to Emily Mackenzie, who's the technical director of TNFD after a long and distinguished career in the British government. Who can imagine that that's possible to have? Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Justin. I was only in the British government for 3 years, so I just we have that small caveat. I escaped quickly. But yeah, thank you very much for coming. I have two big intellectual passions in life, and we're bringing them together today, which is nature and scenarios. So I am delighted to be talking to you on this topic. Yeah, for me, scenarios have always been a passion, actually, since I worked in this field, because for me, it's about future orientation. And somebody said to me when we were at the TNFD launch on Monday that the people who are moving into this at CEO level are usually doing it because of their children. That future orientation is motivating, but also scenarios crystallize choice and strategy. It's that future orientation that brings it home. So I think they're very, very powerful, and I'm really looking forward to digging into that particular aspect of things with an excellent panel today. So we will be covering a few bases just to give you the roadmap for today's session. You're going to have to listen to me just give you a bit of an update on what we've done at TNFD on scenarios guidance. We're then going to have a panel discussion with fantastic experts on scenarios who are going to bring a lot of different insights from the climate and nature, bringing that together in a scenarios context. And then we're going to have two case studies from two companies who have tried this out with us in pilot testing in practice. So it should be a really nice combination of ideas and practical implementation. And then we'll have time for all of you to interrogate all of us and give us ideas as well. So looking forward to the session. Well, here we are, we have an aim. So we're hoping we're going to bring you up to speed on the thinking and use of nature scenarios. It's still nascent compared to climate, but rapidly evolving. And we hope through this session to raise your awareness, but also to stimulate more interest and action in this area. And I have to say, although scenarios is a passion of mine, I do still feel with scenarios, especially when talking to businesses, that sometimes I'm having to advocate for it, which is a shame. So it would be great to have that discussion at the end. How much are people seeing? And I can't wait to hear from David and our other speaker on the case examples for what they learned from this and what the use cases and the benefits from scenarios. So just briefly, I couldn't hold back from just sharing a slide from our launch on Monday. We launched the TNFD's recommendations, as Justin alluded to, on Monday. And it was very exciting because we brought the bees into the New York Stock Exchange. We even had the sound of the bees. We had this amazing audio where bees and birds were playing, as well as amazing visuals. And it was very symbolic. As Justin kindly alluded to, the TNFD is creating a set of recommendations for corporates and financial institutions to use in disclosure akin to the TCFD and building towards an integrated approach, as Justin mentioned. And what we launched on Monday, as well as having this very powerful symbolic launch, was a huge amount of work. So this pyramid represents what we have now put out, and you could now read at your leisure. At the top of the pyramid are a set of 14 recommendations. So we have carried over the TCFD's 11 recommendations and adjusted them to make sense for nature, and then added 3 additional recommendations that the task force felt were needed for understanding nature-related risks and opportunities. And then we have a package of guidance. And the guidance varies from assessment of nature-related issues down to thematic topics. And so I'll just focus that we are going to be, I'm not going to tell you about any of the rest of it. Welcome doing that in the coffee break. But we're going to focus on scenario analysis. So one of the things we published is guidance on scenario analysis. And so what was the reason that the task force felt we should have guidance on scenario analysis? Again, like the TCFD, who were our first sister organization and inspiration, the task force on nature-related financial disclosures has recognized the importance and the utility of scenario analysis for understanding the resilience of your strategy in the face of complex uncertainties. And so we're looking at in an integrated way, what are the possible consequences of nature loss, of climate change, the way governments and markets and society might react to those, and using that to inform business strategy. So it's really about, and just as TNFD, I was just at an event with one of our co-chairs who said he wished we didn't have the D in TNFD because it makes people think it's all about disclosure and compliance. It's really about better choices, better strategy, better risk management. And that's one of the things that the task force felt was important and powerful for scenarios. So we've had a working group. It's been led by our task force member from BlackRock and had a range of different members involved for quite some time. We put out a draft discussion paper, I think it was back in November last year, got lots of really useful feedback and pilot testing from our speakers and others, and then have developed this guidance. And in a nutshell, it's looking at questions. It ultimately is about testing the resilience of your strategy, building strategy, but asking questions like what might be different in the future from today? What might be those, how would those changes unfold over time? What does that mean for the risks and opportunities to us as an organization? And ultimately, what should we do about it? So to anchor the guidance just in TNFD world, when you look at the 14 recommended disclosures from TNFD, they follow the same 4 pillars as TCFD. And there is one specific recommended disclosure, strategy C, which replicates in many ways the equivalent TCFD disclosure to describe the resilience of an organization's strategy, looking at both risks and, interestingly, opportunities, taking into consideration different scenarios. We have gone one step further than TCFD did in that we have created not only a set of recommended disclosures, but also an assessment approach for how you identify and assess nature-related issues. We've called that LEAP. And scenario analysis is included in that overall assessment guidance. This guidance links into that, specifically cooked into our assess phase, where it's a risk tool. Oh, sorry, I've lost my slides. Sorry, guys, I'll bring the slides back up. It's in the assess phase, there's a risk assessment tool, but it actually can inform all elements of the LEAP approach. Here we are, we have a little visual. I won't dwell you with all the details, but LEAP basically moves from locating how you interface with nature, evaluating your dependencies and impacts, assessing your risks and opportunities, and then preparing to respond and report. So we have detailed guidance on scenario analysis and how to use it as a risk assessment method in the assess phase. So just a couple of framing things before I hand to the panel, because these are some of the things I'm hoping to explore with you in the panel today. The task force noted a few differences from climate scenarios, which are probably more familiar to many of us. First of all, nature-related issues are location-specific. So unlike with greenhouse gas emissions, where it doesn't matter where they are emitted, it's going to have a similar effect. Nature-related dependencies and impacts are going to be different in different places. Water extraction in a water-stressed area is going to create more risks than one where water is plentiful. So really the context of where things are happening and the situation in that location really matters. We also don't have one single global goal equivalent to the Paris Agreement. So we don't have something equivalent to the 1.5 degrees around which we can construct normative scenarios as easily. But the good news is, of course, we do now have the global biodiversity framework and the important vision of halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. So we have that with a multitude of targets. So we have the frame, it's just somewhat more multifaceted. But again, to quote my co-chair who just spoke, said it's like a constellation of stars rather than one North Star, which I thought was a beautiful way of putting it. And then we do not yet have, but thanks to Seraphin, we might someday soon have off-the-shelf quantitative nature scenarios akin to the climate scenarios that many of you are probably familiar with from NGFS and the IEA. So those are a few differences, but what we have done is take that as an opportunity, not as a challenge, to think about how to do nature scenarios differently. So the TNFD's scenario guidance is different in these ways. This is what we found. We actually did interviews with a number of businesses who, and financial institutions who were using climate scenarios and struggling. And on that basis, we thought, right, given all the context for nature, given that, let's start really practical, which is one of the things TNFD does well. First of all, we don't have that normative North Star, but we can get lots of insight from exploratory scenarios that explore a range of possible critical uncertainties. So the guidance is currently framed around those exploratory scenarios rather than an achievement of normative targets. We've also developed guidance which is mostly focused on how to develop qualitative storylines. They can then be complemented with targeted modeling and quantification once you identify the issues you want to explore. But they don't start with the expectation that you're going to do a very large integrated assessment modeling exercise, which we felt was important to enable people to get started in a few hours with a workshop, and still get insights. We've also created what we've said are sort of building blocks, a set of standardized elements so that organizations can create their own scenarios using those standard elements, but then customizing the scenarios to their own context, those things like specific locations, specific issues. So we hope that gives people the ability to have, especially investors and financial institutions, a kind of consistent approach, but then tailored to local circumstances. So what you're seeing on the screen, I'm sorry that the text is too small to read because they're quite fun, our scenarios. They're called things like sand in the gears and go fast or go home. But we created a simple, for those of you, I'm sure most of you are familiar with a 4-quadrant 2x2 scenario matrix, which broadly has our 2 critical uncertainties broadly correlated with nature-related physical risks. So ecosystem service degradation, is that happening in a way that is severe with disruptive cost, going to have threshold level impacts or less so? And the other axis is broadly around transition risk. So are the actions that have been taken in the broader context of market, society, technology, moving in the same direction and strong forces, or moving in disparate connections and weak? And then telling stories in each of the 4 quadrants to help facilitate that level exercise. So the bulk of our guidance at the moment is on that kind of participatory, workshop-driven approach. We hope that provides a practical step-by-step guide where you can get going with a couple of hours in a group of people from your business and run a useful exercise. We've also developed a whole host of tools and templates that you can print out and fill out and run your scenario workshops, as well as 4 case studies. And I'm so thrilled we're going to hear from 2 of them directly today. We haven't stopped with advanced approaches. We have a great annex of listing more advanced tools. And we have important collaborations with our knowledge partners, the NGFS, worked with Charlie and team at McKinsey to try and push forward this agenda in advanced scenarios. And that's one of the things I think we'll start to explore with the panel. So that's enough from me. I'm now going to invite our panel to complement those first steps we've taken at TNFD. So I'd like to welcome Serafin, who leads the environmental and social risks analysis team at the Banco de Mexico and is leading the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial Systems work stream on scenarios with a colleague from Banque de France. Charlie Dixon, who helps lead McKinsey's work on nature and biodiversity and has a particular focus on finance, that would be fair to say, and also was a predecessor of mine at TNFD, handed me a baton along with Simon. And Julie McCarthy, who's the managing director at Nature Finance. And Nature Finance have also been partners of the TNFD in really helping us think about scenarios and that importance of climate-nature integration. So let me join you up here. Let me start. If I may, I'm going to start with you, Serafin. I think we should always start with the central banks and supervisors, given their things cascade from them. So I would love to know, you've worked in this field for a long time, and I remember when we had dinner recently, you were very eloquent on this point, about what you've learned from developing and testing climate scenarios that then will translate and what we can leverage for nature scenarios. Justin emphasized in his opening remarks the importance of that integrated approach. So what would be your key learnings from climate?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be participating here. I'm also glad that one of the experts to which we have worked on the task force on nature-related risk It's here. Basically, the learning is huge. I have had the opportunity, for example, of conducting the climate scenario analysis at Banco de Mexico, and I can tell you that the findings while you are studying what will be the implications for climate-related risk, there's always appears the piece of nature-related risk, and in particular, for example, the case of ecosystem services. We are looking at some of the scenarios and on the integrated assessment models. And for example, we see that under some scenarios, there will be a bigger demand for water in the industry, in the agriculture, and that brings us directly to ecosystem services. So this dependence you can start noticing on the climate scenarios already. So that's one of the things that has been happening. And also we have into the task force and in particular into the scenarios team, we have colleagues from the work stream 2 on climate scenarios, allowing us to learn from all this material that they have been developing for the past years. I think that one of the most successful stories of the NGFS is the climate scenarios, which have been establishing themselves. We have seen many central banks already working on scenario analysis from climate perspective, and this is very useful knowledge for us. And it has been mentioned here, you cannot study climate-related risk, and you cannot study biodiversity-related risk if you don't do them in an integrated way. So that's absolutely necessary. But in fact, one of the chapters in which we are working for this report that hopefully is going to be available in December is fully dedicated to the type of models that can be used for scenario analysis. One full chapter on that is a fantastic work by some colleagues that participate in our task force. And here we have evaluated 6 frameworks, modeling frameworks, and some of them are already the ones that are used for climate scenario analysis. So this is also another connection to climate, but also given the particularities of biodiversity, we have also resorted to do the evaluation of some biophysical models. So in case that this type of modeling frameworks and approaches are useful for you, so we will have some very specific recommendations on how they work, what are the underlying assumptions, how they can be used into the narratives that are going to be proposed, suggested by the task force in order to do a scenario analysis. And into that chapter, we also have one particularity that we are very happy with, is that as much as biodiversity is physically, very physically specific, there is also one implication that in our view, I mean, we share this view with the group, is that not enough attention has been put into how the shocks are transmitted through the value chain. And this is key for the nature-based scenario analysis. So this is something that we have also considered from the beginning. It's not something that is going to be added, but we departed with the idea that the shocks that are originated from biodiversity loss and nature loss are going to be transmitted through the value chain. So we are making efforts to incorporate specifically modeling efforts, tools that take into account this. So this is, again, another learning from our colleagues from the climate. We have people that work in the 2 groups at the same time. I'm one of them. I work on the work stream 2 on climate scenario analysis, and I'm co-leading this scenario analysis for nature with Romance Bassman from the Bank of France. So I'll stop here and please ask any questions if you would like to know more.
Yeah, great. We'll make sure everybody has time. I'm sure lots of people have questions about the approach you're taking, but that's a very nice segue to you, Charlie, because the NGFS is moving in the direction of more advanced integrated modeling approaches, which I know many organizations are going to welcome in addition to the central banks and supervisors, particularly financial institutions and large complex corporates who would need that. So we've been working together on the guidance for TNFD on scenarios. You've seen our let's get started practical workshop qualitative approach. What do you think, how can organizations, from what you've seen, build on that to get to more advanced approaches? Where are the next steps going to lie?
Thanks. I think So when you put it at its most basic, scenarios are there to help us deal with uncertainty. And so what does that mean in the context of the TNFD? How might my risks and opportunities as a company change in the future under different circumstances? And so the more complex an organization's operations or its value chain or its investments, the more complex those circumstances are going to be. And that's going to be where these considerations really come into play. So the two types of organizations that you mentioned, financial institutions and multinational corporations, they're typically operating across lots of different sectors, geographies, and they're going to have lots of different relevant impacts and dependencies. So when they come to thinking about scenarios, they're going to have to think about all of these different changes across those sectors, those geographies, and those different risk drivers. So the discussion paper that we're building out as a kind of follow-on to the guidance really tries to practically demonstrate how these types of organizations can build on the 2x2 approach that we just saw and try and move towards an advanced approach that speaks to those many different considerations. Certainly the market feedback I've heard talking to organizations that have tried to put this into practice is there needs to be more clarity on the role that scenarios are going to play in risk assessments. There needs to be a bit of an understanding about what specific outputs are we taking from these scenarios. So we talk a lot about scenarios, but we don't really see that many. So it's difficult to get an idea of what they look and feel like. And then finally, how much of this is qualitative and how much of this is quantitative. So hopefully what we're doing is providing some practical tools and some examples so organizations can start to experiment and play with this and then move towards a more advanced approach, for example, in the future, when potentially the NGFS has published something on nature that looks quite similar to what we have today on climate.
Great. I'm hoping next year, this time next year at Climate Week, we'll be in a really good position to have both that more quantitative guidance and maybe we'll see what's been developed with NGFS. So on this spectrum, Julie, between sort of more qualitative to quantitative approaches and a mix of the two, how do you think, just on a practical basis, businesses can develop them, use them, integrate them into their decision making? What have you seen?
Did I lock it? Can you hear me? Great. So obviously scenarios have a really critical role to play, as we've heard, in bringing the overall sort of systems conditions into focus for financial institutions and businesses. I think one of the key weaknesses of some scenarios to date is that they have been built around targets and desired futures. For example, 1.5 degree warming rather than likely futures. And I think, I'm sure I heard a lot this week. Justin mentioned in his introduction, the most recent IPCC report, we're rapidly heading towards certainly a beyond 1.5 degree warmed world, potentially by 2027. And I think that scenarios that previously seemed like, if they played out, might be on another CEO's watch, for example, increasingly the timeline is compressing. If you're invested heavily in agriculture as a financial institution right now, if you're a multinational commodity trader, you're seeing drought, wildfires, soil quality issues, pollination issues playing out now in real time. And you need to be able to answer as a CEO how your company or financial institution plans to adapt and be resilient in a potentially 2 degree plus warmed world. So in that context, scenarios based on some of these more challenging likely futures are a really important tool. And we see them as part of a broader sort of risk assessment, target setting, and transition planning process, really. So step one is really trying to get a baseline as a financial institution or a company of how aligned you are right now or not with net zero nature positive outcomes. And we see integration is really important. We're doing a pilot right now as Interfinance with an alignment tool that we've developed with a large asset manager in Brazil that's trying to drill down from the portfolio to the asset level to really just get an understanding of exposure and the footprint at this point. Then one is able to, understanding the baseline, move on to actual target setting and transition planning. And that's where we see scenarios really coming in for those transition plans and playing a critical role. to outline the circumstances and the operational environment that they're likely to face. And I should add step 3.1 in that you listed very helpfully earlier. The engagement piece is really critical as well, especially with IPLC communities. As you mentioned, Emily, earlier, right now, there's an effort with TNFD, with Nature Finance, with McKinsey and others to support developing more advanced scenarios for financial institutions specifically, which will be really critical. And the final thing I would say is, along with the really helpful sort of how to get started guidance that you've shared, there's all kinds of qualitative, softer touch ways to do scenario analysis. I mean, even with the recent Task Force on Nature Markets report that we helped to support, it's thinking through different versions of sort of how geopolitics in a nature economy plays out in the coming years, and who are the potential winners or losers, and what does that mean for nature-rich countries in the scheme of things. So I think there's all kinds of useful, very practical ways to get started, and it doesn't need to be the high end of the spectrum necessarily of having a highly formal exercise that then inputs into models, et cetera. There's many tracks. Thanks.
Great, and thanks for that, because you've reminded me, there's a third reason why I love scenarios, is that they stretch your imagination, right? I mean, they really, I think when scenarios are done well in this exploratory way, they push people out of their comfort zone. I've had the pleasure of getting to know some scenario facilitators through this process, and it really pushing people. But unfortunately, as you mentioned with climate, I mean, some of this is really now just around the corner. So I'll maybe come back to you on that, Charlie. Building from what Julie set out, some nice examples with the asset manager in Brazil and others. What examples are you seeing from not just from developing the guidance to practice, examples where, let's say might be organizations here thinking about disclosing against the TNFD recommendations, how they could use scenario-based risk assessment in their decision-making, in their disclosures? How would it work in practice?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I think about the spectrum of different TNFD reporters in this aspect across two different dimensions. So the first is the breadth of analysis that they're interested in. So as we spoke a little bit before in the last question, like, are they interested in just one sector, in one geography, and one type of risk? Or are they looking at multiple things at the same time? Because that's going to really influence the type of information they're looking for from a scenario. The second is the types of outputs that they're looking for. So are they looking for something predominantly qualitative, or are they trying to get to quantitative outputs? So maybe let's take some examples. On the one hand, you could have a multinational beverage producer that wanted to understand how each of its different sites of operation are exposed to water stress. So what are they looking for from a scenario? They want to know what's going to happen to water stress in the future in different locations. Can be relatively qualitative. So on the other side, we could potentially have a bank that's maybe done a heat map exercise, and it's found some important risk hotspots for its portfolio. It knows that water pollution is an issue for its mining portfolio, and it knows that deforestation is an issue for its manufacturing portfolio. They've got a much more complex task. So what are they looking for from a scenario? They're thinking, where is water pollution an issue? Where might that actually translate into a cost for my counterparties, so the organizations that I'm lending to? And where does the same happen for deforestation? So where are there jurisdictions like the EU where there could be legislation coming in that's relevant for my counterparties, so the businesses I lend to? So it's a much richer set of information that they're looking from the scenarios. And so I know what you're all thinking at this stage. This is great, but we don't have any of this information. So where do we go? Well, I'm very happy to tell you that there is some information and some examples that you can start to work with today. So the UNPRI has published the first publicly available integrated climate and nature scenario. It's called the Forecast Policy Scenario. So it looks at not only what are the climate levers of action that are being taken across the world today, but also what's been done to try and reverse nature loss too. And so in our discussion paper that's set to come out in a few months, we'll be taking a series of really practical use cases. So example TNFD users, like we've just spoken about, using the outputs from this scenario and doing worked examples to show how that feeds into their risk assessment process. The idea being this provides those tools that means that you can, as a reporter, get started playing around with this and understand, no matter whether you're at the beginning of your journey or a little bit more advanced, how you can start interacting with these scenarios over time.
Brilliant, Charlie. And I'm very excited for this discussion paper in classic TNFD style. When Charlie says a few months, it's going to be October, I think, just to put him on the hotspot. But yeah, we hope to get it out in the next month or two. The way TNFD publishes discussion papers is for the task force to be able to get feedback and consultation. So we'll put things out as draft, and then we will be hoping to fold this more sort of insights from that analysis into our guidance over time, just as we'll hope to fold in NGFS's work as that develops. And that's a nice bridge to you, Seraphin. So I know a big milestone for the NGFS happened just a few weeks ago with the publication of your conceptual framework. So huge congratulations for that. That was a big milestone, and also amazing messaging around its publication about the importance of nature-related risks to the mandates, being core to the mandates of central banks and supervisors. So I know there's a lot in the conceptual framework, but what was it specific insights for nature-related scenarios?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, all the credit should be given to the guys that did this fantastic work. We tried to be as connected as possible, as you can imagine, between the scenarios team and the conceptual framework team, because it was necessary. And the conceptual framework provides the basis for the understanding of the concepts first, because we need to be having a common language, but also the risk and the transmission channels. So that was key from the conceptual framework that guided our work on the scenarios teams. We are working together all the time. We have common meetings all the time. So this was very important for the scenarios team. Something that I also would like to mention is that although it is a key first step, we identified precisely during the conceptual framework elaboration the need for scenario analysis. Why? Because this current trend of environmental degradation is not stopping. So if we only take into account the current risk, we will be in serious problems of underestimating what might happen in the future. So that's one of the key important things. And the second one is that if we are lucky enough to have the policies being pushed and implemented, then we have a lot of transition risk, because many of the companies might not be ready, are not ready to consider that into the risk management perspective. And the final point that also helped us to elaborate a plan is that the past data is not a good predictor of the future. And this is key and important aspects like tipping points. We don't know when there are going to happen some of the tipping points related to nature degradation. And for that, scenario analysis will be very useful in trying to understand how this could have implications in the future. So these are the things that were very important for us as common ground for the two teams working together. But also it gave us the material to think about what shall we thinking on how we are going to design scenarios for the future. And we think that importantly, first, we need to identify the risk to be able to do so. And we are resorting to a network of external experts. We have two very important groups that provide us advice on how to elaborate these narratives in order to identify the possible risk and the transition channels. One of the teams is the Oxford University, and Nicola Lockley is here. So it has been very useful to collaborate with external experts, and it has been key, because this type of knowledge is normally not into the sort of tools that are being used at the central banks. But as you said also, the conceptual framework stated very clearly that it is within the mandate of central banks to be concerned about this, because nature degradation has tremendous economic implications and for the financial system as well. So that's a key message from the conceptual framework. It is within our mandate. We cannot just step aside and then say, well, this is a problem from the federal government. This is something that, no. It is material. The risks are material, financial risk and economic risk. And in the case of Mexico, at least, the governor of the central bank is an advisor, an economic advisor to the president. So the central bank needs to advise the government in the sense that if there are future risks on the horizon, we need to take them into account. Nature-related risks have inflation consequences, financial stability consequences, and now I think that we are more or less agree that this is important, and hopefully that is very well stated on the conceptual framework. Now, on the technical document that we are preparing, hopefully it's going to be available in December. We are hoping to get there. We are in the middle of one of the most important phases of the writing, and luckily we are going to have comments from the TNFD. Is one of the people that we are hoping to have comments about this. And again, the exploration on the approach from the narratives to the modeling and to the impacts along the supply chain has been a fantastic learning for us. Again, with a lot of help from external experts. And it's very, very important to approach the scientists who are working on this. We had a conference organized at the Bank of Mexico a couple of months ago. And we had people from the academia, from the biology, we have people from indigenous communities. And something that I got a very clear message is that it's not only that the biologists need to learn about finance and economics, but we, the people in finance and economics, need to learn about biology, because this is one of the tools that are going to be more and more important and central bank, as the same with climate. So we had to learn about climate, but now we have to learn a lot about nature and biology at the central banks.
Thank you, Serafin. That was amazing. And it's really exciting to hear the insights that you're having and the progress you're making. It's going to be very powerful. So maybe we'll just finish this segment with one final question to you, Julie, but I'd like you all to stay here after we hear the case studies, and then we're going to open up to everybody. You can save up your questions because we have a chance to ask Julie, Serafin and Charlie questions later. But in your own experience and hearing Serafin and Charlie, how do you think nature and climate can be effectively integrated? Justin set us up nicely to say that's, of course, how it has to be. But we have been talking about these things separately in this conversation. So how do we, as quickly as possible, move from talking about them separately to having them integrated?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. It's really heartening to hear about NGFS's efforts and momentum in this domain. I mean, hopefully it's clear at this point that we don't actually think there should be nature scenarios or climate scenarios. We think that they need to be integrated going forward because of the dynamic, interactive feedback loop effects between them. They're interlocking gears, and it's negligent effectively at this point to separate them out based on the scientific knowledge that we have and based on the impacts on financial markets and economies as we understand them. You know, kudos to TNFD for really recognizing that up front and sort of building it into the framework, which is going to be hugely important going forward as a data source for different kinds of scenario work. We have been working with another NGFS member, the ECB, in a partnership with PIC, the Potsdam Institute, to develop the first integrated nature climate risk scenario framework using the boreal forest as an initial case study. That there will be an initial paper that also comes out in December, and then a sort of final first initial findings that comes out in June next year. We hope that that will help to feed in to the broader NGFS process, which is one of the reasons why we were excited to partner with PIC, because they've been such an important inputter on the climate side. I think based on all of this experience, a few insights about how to integrate the two effectively into scenarios. I mean, one, and I think it's been mentioned already, is just that we need to make sure that scenarios move beyond physical risk to also include transition risk in terms of the policy impacts, the market impacts, the technological impacts, the tipping points. That's not always included in terms of the stakeholders at the table and science and finance kind of talking across to each other, and that's going to be really critical going forward. Just one example of that, you know, in the same way that net zero transition plans have become sort of a fact of life for many multinationals, for example, at this point, because of the global biodiversity framework, because of the TNFD framework, we really believe that very soon the same sort of expectations for net zero, nature positive alignment reporting, transition planning are going to come into play, including from consumer expectations and pressure, let alone sort of policy imperatives, just to give one transition dynamic that should be incorporated. I think another really key piece is high quality data for nature. As with anything, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out. And I have to say, rightly, we talk about nature in different ways being more complicated than climate, but for anyone who read the most recent issue of the Nature Journal, there was a wonderful article. It was on carbon credits, but it happened to mention in passing that satellite imagery from 2021 identified that there were 70% more methane emissions in the atmosphere than were reported nationally in the aggregate. So there are a lot of data challenges on the climate side, to be sure. On the nature front, the state of nature, it's not just tons of carbon being emitted. You have ecosystems with land and air and water and soil quality and species intactness. You have lots of dynamics going on at once, and separating those dynamics out is also not helpful because there are interactive effects, but you need to develop data that's simplifies that complexity enough for market actors to be able to use. So we've been involved with one effort. There are a number of them out there called SEED. It's a biodiversity complexity index out of ETH Zurich, and it uses geospatial data, it uses AI, it uses a lot of really interesting tools to pull together a holistic state of nature assessment for any pixel on land, basically, at this point. It's still got a ways to go, but that's one example of exciting kind of biodata developments that we think can really help strengthen the quality of scenarios. Maybe just the final thing that I would note is that a lot of scenarios focus too far out in our view. So there's a lot of 2050 scenarios, there's a lot of 2100 scenarios, but as we've all been discussing, we're headed towards 1.5 degrees in 2027. There are increasingly compressed timelines and tipping points. So we'd love to see scenarios also with a much more near-term focus, which we think will be much more decision relevant and useful to corporate and financial institution leaders. Thanks.
Very, very interesting. And we all have a lot of reading this autumn. So if it's okay, we're now going to pivot to some real case examples. I think we were going to see if Hiroshi could join us on the screen. Hiroshi Fujikawa is joining us. Great, we can see you, Hiroshi. Welcome. I hope you can hear us.
Good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon, and we can hear you. That's excellent. So Hiroshi is kindly joining us from Kirin. Where are you based, Hiroshi?
In Tokyo.
Okay, you're calling from
So,
Tokyo, so it must be late for you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
Crazy. I don't know, late or early. It depends if you've
Early.
slept yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so you definitely get the prize for most commitment for being here. We're really, really grateful for not only you joining us, but to Kirin's work to pilot test with the TNFD, the scenarios guidance. And we'll hand to you, please, just to give everybody here a flavor of what your experiences were and what lessons you learned along the way.
Okay, got it. Now let me share this, my presentation today. Can you see it?
Perfect. We're seeing it very clearly.
Okay, great. Good afternoon once again, everyone, and thank you very much for your invitation and giving me an opportunity to join this TNFD event in New York and to make a brief presentation on our nature-related activities. My name is Hiroshi Fujikawa from Kirin Sustainability Department, and I have about 10 minutes presentation today, and I will explain how we apply for TNFD disclosure framework and how we collaborate with the TNFD people. And for those who do not know the Kirin Group, I'd like to briefly explain the company profile. And the Kirin Group, with the net sales value of approximately $13.3 billion, and operating income of $1.3 billion. And then originally started as a beer company, but its current main business domain include soft drinks and business in Japan and Australia and the New Zealand beer business and the US craft beer and soft drinks, and interestingly, a pharmaceutical business as well, because we are based on the fermentation technology. And since Kirin was the original beer company and using the natural capital, such as malt and hops and water as a raw materials, and ferment it with the yeast to create products. So it was originally engaged in initiatives for nature and environment from the early stage. As a result, we have been supporting TCFD since 2018 and a TNFD consortium member since its inception in 2021. And in July 2022, last year, we used the LEAP approach as the first company in our environment report. And this is our environment approach. And at the heart of Kirin Group's strategy for solving environment issue is our holistic approach. I believe this approach is very similar to a TNFD approach. And we emphasize the importance of holistic solutions to the 4 key themes of our environment vision. One is the biological resources and water resources, and containers and packaging, and climate change. And we approach them holistically instead of individual responses. Okay, then I would like to show you a few examples which I collaborate with the TNFD people. Kirin is the #1 packaged tea product producer in Japan. And we also collaborate with the Rainforest Alliance since 2013. And we conducted an assessment using a LEAP approach and for tea farms in Sri Lanka, for which we have a high level of regional dependence as an area producing raw materials. So we have been using Sri Lanka tea leaves in Kirin Gogono Kocha, which is afternoon tea products, for more than 30 years. And since products release, and we use this fact in the marketing. And compare with many other products, this product could be described as extremely dependent on the area where raw materials are produced. So in the L locate phase of the LEAP approach, we selected 10 farms in Sri Lanka that are close to nature parks and other locations, and check their latitude and longitude, and use the global map of ecoregions and IUCN global ecosystem typology to develop an understanding of the ecosystem of around these tea farms. In the evaluate E phase, we used various papers researched and published in Sri Lanka to identify relevant environmental assets and ecosystem services, and thus developed an understanding of our dependency and impact. And although our implementation of test phase is a work in progress, the results show that there are many items in which we can contribute to mitigating the impact on natural capital through the Kirin Group's and Rainforest Alliance training to support the acquisition of sustainable farming certification, which has been ongoing since 2013. And it appears we can therefore say that these measures are very effective in solving issues related to natural capital in Sri Lanka. And in the future, we intend to move on to the A and P assess and prepare phases of the LEAP approach for Sri Lanka's tea farms, in which we will analyze and assess the effectiveness of our activities in detail. And we have also started supporting the acquisition of certification at the coffee farms in Vietnam as well, which will enable us to understand the local conditions in detail. And accordingly, we intend to conduct similar assessment in the future and clarify the direction of our efforts. And in the LEAP approach, we must check each individual region for phases from E onward because the level of impact varies from region to region. And we think we need to involve our suppliers in the future in surveys. And also in March this year, we collaborated with TNFD for a workshop. The purpose of the TNFD's request to us, Kirin Group, to participate in the pilot test was to verify and practically of the TNFD beta version 3 scenario analysis framework. In response, the Kirin Group held a scenario analysis workshop in March 2023 at our new Belgium brewery, Craft Brewery in Colorado, US, where water stress is very high. Because the Colorado River stretches from its source, Colorado, through Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and California, there are legal restrictions on the use of its water based on the Colorado River Compact, established more than 100 years ago between Colorado as the upstream state and the downstream state. For example, in Colorado, where there's a flourishing agriculture industry, we found that some farmers were trying to reduce water use, not only through equipment, such as adapting irrigation system, but also by adapting regenerative agriculture to improve soil health and water retention. The New Belgium Brewery has a good understanding of such regional developments and is considering using barley produced through regenerative agriculture. At the New Belgium Brewery, we are trying to work together with the community to solve the issue of high water stress. And this is an example of how we are already putting into practice, working with local communities to set targets as required in the methodology of SVTs for nature, which aims to set scientific targets related to natural capital. Lastly, I just want to touch on our activities in our wine vineyard. At the Tengu-sama Vineyard in Koshu City in Yamanashi Prefecture in Japan, we are collaborating with the National Agriculture and Food Research Organization to conduct a research project that is rare even on a global basis, relating to changes in ecosystem as a piece of derelict farm land is converted into a hedgerow style vineyard that can be harvested. When we investigated the derelict farmland prior to its cultivation in 2016, we found only insect and plant species extremely lacking in diversity as a result of damage from deer eating the vegetation. Since we fenced and reclaimed the area in 2017, however, the landscape has changed to one like a vineyard, and we are seeing how the ecosystem has become richer during this process. In vegetation surveys in 2021, we confirmed that existence of 103 species, an increase from the previous year when it was 88. And by 2022, this number has risen to 108 species. So this is this concludes my presentation. And but I just wanted to point out that as somebody mentioned earlier, that Kirin's holistic approach to environment is very similar to TNFD holistic and integrated approach to the environment and the nature. So we appreciate the framework you provided just recently, and also we would like to expand this scenario analysis to other agriculture products as well. Okay, thank you very much for your patience and listening, and I hope that my presentation in some way is useful for the future TNFD activities, and I'm continue to be looking forward to working with the TNFD people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiroshi-san. Very good. thank you so much for all of the testing you've done, not only on scenarios, but on the whole LEAP approach and now bringing in the monitoring. And I think your insights, especially combining the science-based targets, networks, methodologies with TNFD, many aspects that you've provided fantastic feedback on. So thank you. And if you would like to stay with us, I'm sure there will be questions for you, but if you also want to go to bed, it will be understood. So let me pass to David. If it's okay, we'll bring up David's slides. Okay, if you could just stop sharing your screen, Hiroshi, I think if you can just stop share, we'll still be able to have you with us, I hope. Great. And hand to David Croft, who is not only representing here to share his experience from Racket, but is a task force member from the TNFD. I've had the pleasure to work with him. So he has been one of the 40 brains behind the TNFD recommendations. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Emily. Can I manage without a microphone? Or is this going out on? It's going live, so I'm going to have to speak on this. First of all, a little bit about Reckitt. You might not know Reckitt as an entity, but depending on where you are in the world, I'll guarantee you know our brands. If you're US based, you'll know Lysol. If you're European based, you'll know Dettol, and so on and so forth around the world. Today, I want to give you a little bit of a background into what our approach has been to bring the TNFD frameworks and biodiversity into the heart of the business conversation. And to do that, I want to bring that to life and think with you a bit weirdly about elephants and condoms. Now this, I'll guarantee you won't get that blend very often, evening Climate Week. But the rationale for this is that one of our biggest brands, it's $1 billion plus brand, is probably the biggest condom brand in the world, and it's Durex. And it's based on rubber farmed in Southeast Asia, which many of you know is going to have challenges of biodiversity and deforestation and human rights and without some of the smallholder farmers that underpin that rubber farming in southern Thailand, we don't have $1 billion brand. And so when we get to nature-related financial risk, you start to appreciate that this becomes a very big conversation within the business, for the brand, with consumers, and especially with our investors, who have already been asking me in pretty tough terms about what are we doing to measure the impact of this financial risk? What are we doing to mitigate it? And how will we know that the interventions that we've got are making a difference? And that, trust me, opens up a whole can of worms, if I can mix more my metaphors. We should have taught worms when we talked about birds and bees and bulls and so on and so forth. But worms don't make nice noises, and it wouldn't have sounded as good in the stock exchange. So we looked at all of our key raw materials from an agricultural perspective, and we are not a big agri-food business. But as I've said, latex is a big ticket. We thought about a double materiality approach. We applied that, and we thought about the impact for the business, and we thought about the impact through the business. And particularly that led us to 5 key ecosystems and value chains, of which latex was one of them. Why latex? Durex, I've said, risk to the ecosystem, but also risks in the supply context. And this is a socioeconomic risk as well as a biodiversity risk. Smallholder farmers, often not making an awful lot of money. And we see this in other systems as well, where if they do not have the right socioeconomic outcomes for themselves, they're going to make certain choices. And if you don't have a lot of money, and the only asset you can access easily is new land, then your tendency is to chop some more forest down to grow some more trees that make you money. And oftentimes we forget those very basic socioeconomic drivers that smallholders are really driven on, because if the choice is do that or send your kids to school or put food on the table, we know what choice we would all end up making as well. And we kid ourselves if we do not remember that this is at the heart of some of the conversations that we've got. And I'll come back to that, because when we did the scenario planning exercise, the smallholder element was a critical part of the conversation. The other conversation that we have to have with ourselves is land use. And even though rubber farming has been around Southeast Asia, Malaysia, especially for about 100 years, I've been to the plantations, it's 100 years, and more in some cases, there is still a land use pressure going on because rubber doesn't make as much money for plantation owners as palm oil does. They lose about $3,500 per year per hectare. And so I've got another socioeconomic pressure coming in. So this makes it a very complex balancing act to try and strike, and then to drive biodiversity resilience beyond that. We also knew that we had to think differently about how we would measure and try and address the interventions as a result. And this is when we began programs of activity with a couple of key partners. And I'm going to take you through some of the details of this. Forgive some of the slides, there's a lot of detail on them, but I think it's important to give you the depth that we tried to get to with the metrics. We work particularly on this with two key partners, Earthworm Foundation, who work on the ground with our farming communities, and we also work with Oxford University's nature-based insetting team, and they helped us develop, if I can make the slides work, help. Go on, move me on manually. We'll go old school. I'm going to sound like Chris Whitty for those of you who remember. The American contingent won't know what that means. I'm sorry. This was the framework that we have developed jointly with NBI and also with input from Earthworm and the farming communities. And I think it's important to keep that community context as well. And it starts to think about how biodiversity, climate, sustainable development indicators feed through, and how we move from a qualitative level of metric, which took information from Oxford, from the Natural History Museum's modeling in the UK, from Earthworm on the ground, into a more detailed quant approach. Can we go to the next slide, please? Ah, there we go. That's my mistake. There we go. And this gives you also a timeline that we're setting for ourselves, because we know this is a multi-year conversation. But it runs through, just through this particular piece on latex, but going into other value chains as well, towards 2030, about how we first of all begin to measure qualitatively and then quantitatively, and then through monitoring and evaluation of the interventions that we make, what is happening with the biodiversity in this location. And next slide, please. And the next one, there we go. Just go to the next one, it's got a title on it. There we go. So this now starts to cut to the chase. And trust me, this is the high level one, because we're going to show you the detail one in a minute. And it's most of the detail, not all of the detail. This gives you a sense of how the system tries to measure the landscape boundaries, the nature of land use, about how the different types of activity impact on what is termed this biodiversity impact metric, BIM, which is a methodology that's been around for 10, 15 years at the very least, that we've been trying to build up and make something work. This high level one is underpinned by a set of quantitative data that gets you to a whole host of detail. And to tell you where this BIM gets to, can I go 2 slides on, please? There we go. Now, the other thing my colleagues at Oxford would ask me to say straight away is, please do not read anything into the 90.6 number, because this is an old model and we've evaluated it. But what I wanted to do is to show you this, to give you a sense of when we're measuring biodiversity impact, we're tracking land use, we're tracking farming footprint, we're tracking how this impacts through to eutrophication, the impact of monoculture, how carbon is factored into this, and where carbon is part of that solution. And I'll come back to the importance of that in a minute. The bit that you can't see on this, that has been work in progress since I put those slides together, is the social element of it. Because the farming community that I was talking about before are the critical actors in this. But they're also critical to providing the solution. Because what this allows us to do going forward is measure the impact that interventions will create. And now we have a program worked with Earthworm, with those farmers, that is based on already paying a social premium that creates a fair trade approach to the latex that we buy, that is allowing the farmers to reinvest in agronomy and better agricultural methodology that we're helping to train them in. That also means they're applying a more regenerative agricultural approach. Sometimes they were already doing intercropping. Because if you don't have a lot of money, if you've got land, you can plant something else on, you're going to grow something else on it. But they're also starting to do more stuff about ground cover that prevents weeds, that improves the productivity. They're helping to mitigate some of the other challenges. They don't have a lot of money, they don't put a lot of fertilizer down, but they're making certain that they do not let that wash into any nearby watercourses. And that adds to the eutrophication conversation that's also measured on there. In the fullness of time, what I would see coming out of this is the ability to measure a change in BIM, maybe even measure and capture some carbon conversations that leads to an additional ecosystem service payments to farmers. And that allows us to invest in nature-based solutions that strengthen that supply chain because it strengthens the socioeconomic element that is often at the heart of that smallholder farming conversation. That was a long-winded way of getting to 4 scenarios that we worked through with the TNFD team. But within that, and you can read about this in the guidance that was published on Monday. I've forgotten what day it is. It's one of those weeks, isn't it? But we knew that there were various things that we had to contend with. Quality, seasonality, different rainfall patterns impact the quality of latex you get. The amount of water that's in the ground impacts the quality of latex. How you engage with farmers. Can you talk to 1,000 individual smallholders? Very difficult unless they're organized into some form of collective. So the fair trade approach helped us with that. Consumer sentiment, deforestation, human rights, just fair pay and living standards and things like that all play through. And what it led us to in this scenario is there's the sense that if we did not work well with the smallholder farmers, if we did not build that relationship with the community, then the long-term impact was something we would be fairly powerless to act on. But at the same time, the long-term resilience of that supply chain that we depend upon would also be at risk. And that created a wonderful sweet spot. It created a sweet spot of value for the business, value for the farmers, and value for the ecosystem that they are part of. And that's where we see this evolving to further. And so it's not just in the case of TNFD about risk. It's also about how do you create opportunity to find that sweet spot that becomes part of regenerative agriculture and stronger communities and stronger supply chains for the long term. And we'll be taking that same methodology into the 4 or 5 other key value chains that we have upstream as we go forward in the TNFD framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was a wonderful way to end and have that conclusion of how it gave you insights into the resilience of your strategy and informed your decision making, and also why we put opportunities into our disclosure. Because I looked back at TCFDs this morning and I wrote to the team and said, remind me why we put opportunities in our recommended disclosure again, because it wasn't in the TCFD one. Great. So we now have about 10 minutes for any questions, comments from all of you. Yes.
So great. That was really interesting. My question is on economic incentives for the farmers. So how exactly does that work? What's the real economic incentive for them to improve their BIM, for example?
I'll go with this. I'm not good with technology, you can tell. The starting point was some work we originally did with the Danish Institute of Human Rights. And we looked at the challenges that those smallholders communities had to begin with. And what's perhaps worth remembering is that natural latex is pegged against synthetic latex. So when the price of oil is low, the price of synthetic rubber is low, and therefore the price that farmers get paid in the commodity market is low. So we began this process by thinking, how do you solve a livelihoods issue first and foremost? And then secondly, it became, to your question, how do you then incentivize people to go further and start to think through a framework of an ecosystem services payment, how would we add further to the current subsidy that we pay? That's something we're still working through in terms of exactly what that will look like. And the TNFD framework, to my mind, helps people to do that, because there's a corollary that is going to happen. As soon as I start to declare, as we follow the TNFD disclosure requirements, the nature-related financial risk that Reckitt faces on latex, then that same big investor who's already asked me the pointy questions is going to say, so how much are you spending to mitigate that risk, and how are you spending it? And that's where, for us, you create that incentive for the farmers, that we can measure the impact that the different methodologies of regenerative agriculture and indeed other tiers of activity will create. And we can reward that through an ecosystem services payment that gives it longevity, as well as adding to the economic value. And it changes. And I think actually, Tony said this really well at the launch on Monday evening. We have, for thousands of years, never really had recognized the value of natural resources. By starting to think through that ecosystem services payment, we start to change the value equation that smallholder farmers especially face. And I think the approach that we're thinking through of this ecosystem services option that has a carbon opportunity for us, as well as mitigating a biodiversity risk, begins to add a different value stream for those farmers. And I think that could go a long way in lots of different agricultural approaches, but it's certainly smallholder farmers who benefit most.
Thank you, David. I think I saw yes question. Yeah, thanks, Felipe.
Hi, everyone. Courtney from Anthesis Group. A lot of what we do is help companies with climate and nature risk assessments. And a lot of what you said about that integrated approach, I think is really great. One thing that we are working on, and I think a lot of people struggle with, is the compounding implications from multiple risks, happening at the same time, what that looks like. So I'm curious how scenarios or even the quantitative modeling takes that into consideration.
Thank you for that question. And maybe I can add to it, because it was a question, and I'm going to direct this to you, Serafin, and then anyone else who wants to take it. But one of the things I've wrestled with when one moves from qualitative to quantitative with scenarios is these assumptions of marginal change rather than threshold level change. And you emphasize that with the tipping points. So building on that, how do you overcome that through what you've learned from your science partners so far?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and we have been thinking on that also from the beginning, and that's why we jumped also into the evaluation of biophysical models, because they might be the key to provide multiple shocks instead of modeling, let's say, only one type of shock, because ecosystems are connected, ecosystem services are also connected, and not only that, ecosystem services flows globally. So that's why we wanted to have this modeling feature of modeling the possible spillovers around the value chain, because if you are only taking into consideration one type of shock, you are falling short. So these are the two key important elements that we are taking into account. So we jumped into biophysical models precisely because of that, because it's not only one ecosystem service, only one ecosystem stopping working or one ecosystem service not being available. All of them are connected, and also ecosystem services flows around the globe. So the effect is not going to be felt only on Sri Lanka or Indonesia, because that is going to travel all around the world, all around the global supply chain. So that's how we are thinking on doing it. But again, we are only providing recommendations that these type of models can be useful and also need to be taken into account into the equation. And again, this is why we have been working very hard, well, my colleagues on that group, on the modeling efforts, because it would be very dangerous to go out and say that we estimate that the impact is of this size. Why? Because if an underestimation, and coming from an effort as important, as global as the NGFS, comes out with a very timid estimate, very under where the real value is, then we are not making a good service. And that's key, to have into consideration explicitly that. And also some new tools around biophysical modeling, but also about remote sensing. We think that that is also useful to take that multiple shocks into consideration. And that's why the modeling bit is taking us a lot of effort, but we think that putting forward the progress and the advancement that we have been able to write down into this report is key. And we hope that it's going to be useful for the community.
And I'm hoping it will stimulate a lot more science in this area, which would be great. Did you want to add?
Yeah. Now not working. You can hear me. I think there's just one other element that your comments bring up for me, which is the risk of scenarios work advancing within the finance sector, the private sector more broadly, more quickly than within the real economy. And the finance sector then starting to integrate, expect, feel like some of these tipping points and shocks are on the horizon, and sort of withdrawing from particularly exposed sectors before a country like Brazil, for example, is prepared for that level of disengagement and divestment and the livelihood issues and instability that causes, which is why I think making sure that this is a conversation that very much includes ministries of finance and many others is absolutely essential.
Maybe one very small thing just on that is that I think is also a perspective. So you can look at saying the interdependencies between climate and nature make it more challenging and more difficult. But I see a lot of, in particular, banks and multinational corporations try and think of this as an opportunity. So when we think of those interdependencies, how can I nature-proof my decarbonization strategy? That's the starting point. And so is what I'm assuming about bioenergy or supporting consistent with a nature-positive land use system? Is the extraction of minerals needed for EV battery uptake going to have impacts on nature that I'm not comfortable with? So those types of questions are one of the most useful places to start there.
Brilliant. So we have one final question, and then I will hand to Justin for some reflections on the session.
Hi, thank you so much to the panelists. It's been a really great discussion here. A bit of a comment and a request for the scenarios development here. So we started piloting the climate scenario analysis and integrating a bit of the nature considerations and drivers from IPR recently and some medium-sized companies. And unlike some of the climate scenarios where you have sectoral narratives there, the IPR doesn't have that yet, also geographic ones. So for companies trying to, have comparable or somewhat comparable risk and opportunity analysis, it would be great to have those in there, in addition to the kind of the WBCSD roadmaps for sectors that we had accompanying that. Additionally, for that, we have the executive order for national capital accounts here. So not just looking at sectors, but geographies. And then like for the climate policies where we have current policies scenarios there, integrating in the national like biodiversity strategies and plans. So if we have that and say, that'll help us forecast a little bit better. Thank you.
Great, really appreciate that as a suggestion and would like to follow up with you on that. So thanks very much, Charlie, Serafin, Julie, David, and Hiroshi, I hope is maybe still with us. And over to Justin for some closing remarks.
What a horrible job after such an amazing panelist. So guys, thank you. That was fantastic. A few thoughts. Indebted for various remarks this afternoon. That was such an enriching presentation. Particularly, actually, Emily, on your slides, the sand in the gears and speed up or go home. It's worth reflecting that we have a lot of sand and the gears aren't working so well. The home we had in the Holocene is actually no longer available because we're now moving into the Anthropocene. So going home is no longer the option. We have to speed up. Secondly, the thoughts around how the shocks are resonating through the value chain. Also massively important, as we've heard, David, your fantastic presentation as well. It's so important that the quantitative guidance, as Charlie mentioned, is there, but that needs to be done in a way which is accessible and actually affordable too. And I chair a small asset management company doing regenerative ag and forestry, advise another couple. The cost of doing this is actually quite expensive and it has to be done in an accessible way, which also means that we are not disintermediating the local communities and the smallholders, which is absolutely key. Indebted both to Hiroshi for actually staying up, but also for being able to make the happy link between LEAP and also enrich the earth with positive impact, which I think we can use now as ERPI, which is great. Which also then going back to the issue of Hiroshi's, actually Serevin's point that the past data that we have is not a guide to the future. And I think that's really keen. As Nicola Ranger, who is here, who is one of the world's experts on risk, our reliance for financial modeling on data that is no longer relevant in terms of valuing risk and monetizing that risk is a real issue we need to be aware of. I was going to say elephant trap, which we're giving back to David's happy combination of elephant condoms and worms, which is a picture which is going to stay with me as much as the bees and the bulls and the bears in the stock exchange. But also your point, David, I think which was so key, which is on this issue of how do we reconcile competing but entirely rational economic decision making into something which makes sense. And that I think is not only the issue of risk and opportunity, but also how we actually clearly identify what the milestones are along those processes. And also to thank Julie for your point about the real problem about capital flight. So there's another massive exercise going on about risk, again, which Nicola's involved with, which is looking at risk and how you monetize risk in terms of the capex and the opex of building resilience in. If you apply that to countries which are massively in debt and massively vulnerable to climate change and massively vulnerable to biodiversity loss, the reasons to invest become pretty complicated, even when you have a supply chain which is massively embedded in these countries. So we have to have a parallel system of supporting these countries to build up the resilience. Last point I'd like to make, and I just see in the back here, Lai Romero, who runs Lobelia, which is an amazing remote sensing outfit in Barcelona. The benefit of this approach we're taking here, and it's been mentioned a couple of times in terms of how remote sensing operates. The carbon market, the biodiversity market, plus remote sensing means that we have the ability, I think, David, to your point, of democratizing these markets so that those who don't have access to big finance have access to markets and the capital markets in a way which isn't possible. Unless we can do that, we don't actually break the inequity which we've embedded in the system. So this combination, TCFD, TNFD, the KPIs linked to macrofinance, the work that we're doing on the regulatory systems are then linked into remote sensing and the transparency which we require to democratize everything we're talking about. This cannot be a conversation in lovely rooms, beautiful people, a long way from those who are most vulnerable. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Wonderful panel. Lovely.